So let's take a look at Angular's timeout service. The timeout service is very much like JavaScript's set timeout with some important differences, which we'll illustrate here. So let's create this h3 element that binds to name, and then let's come over to our controller. And when the controller is first created, we're going to use the timeout service to execute this line of code, setting the scope.name equal to John Doe after 3 seconds. If we go over to our browser and refresh, you'll see nothing here for 3 seconds, and then there the name shows. So if we refresh that again, and you can see after 3 seconds the name appears. But you may have noticed that this timeout is returning a promise that we can then use to cancel the timeout. So if we come over to our page again, and let's create a button that's going to call cancel on the controller. So let's create that function, cancel. So cancel, when we call it, is just going to call timeout.cancel, and it's going to pass in that promise that was created when the timeout was created. So let's go back to our page again and refresh. Now I have that cancel button. If I do nothing, then the name still appears. But if after refreshing I hit cancel before the timeout finishes, then you can see that the timeout never fired. Okay, so this works very much like JavaScript's set timeout method. So let's take a look at why we need a timeout service. To illustrate that, we will need another element on the page, something that will cause the bindings to be reevaluated on our page. So let's just come over here and create an input box, and it will have a binding, and it really doesn't matter what we're binding to. So if I come back over to our controller, and let's change this to, instead of using the timeout service, let's just let it use JavaScript's set timeout function, which has the same syntax. And then we've added this other input box on here just so that we can cause a change in the model that causes Angular to reevaluate the bindings. So if we come over to our page now and refresh, notice that we're sitting here and we're waiting and we don't see the name. Well, that set timeout has run, but it occurred on a separate thread outside of the Angular world, and Angular has no idea that the value of that name binding has changed. And that can be demonstrated by causing Angular to reevaluate bindings, which it does whenever a value on the model changes. So if I type in something here, again, remember this is not bound to name, this is just bound to a field called foo. But that did cause Angular to reevaluate the bindings, which immediately showed John Doe. And what that shows is that in the controller, set timeout did run immediately, or it did run after 3 seconds, and it did set scope.name to John Doe, but it just never showed up on the page because Angular wasn't aware that it happened. And so using Angular's timeout service allows that timeout to occur inside the Angular world so that it can watch for changes that occur when that timeout expires. And that's all there is to the timeout service. Okay, here's another quiz. Which service would you use to display localization-based date, time, or numeric formats? The answer, of course, is locale. Why would you use timeout versus set timeout? Because Angular is aware of model changes made by the timeout service. Which service does Angular use internally to process a page and handle directives on the page? The compile service.